So yeah, I guess we can begin, and if more people join on, we'll just add them on as we're talking. But yeah, I think it's interesting timing considering this astrological event that just occurred, which at least the themes that Fida was revealing are really resonant with Crowley's idea of the new Aeon. Like the new Aeon in Crowley's mind is, to me, it's basically the same as the Age of Aquarius. It represents a new dispensation in perspective and consciousness of humankind, and an orientation away from externalized sources of transcendence, of God, which has been the case for many thousands of years. If you look at the main religions of the world, which look to something outside of you as your source of divine illumination, rather in the line, every man and woman is a star, really, I think encapsulates a lot of his perspectives on what the new Aeon would present, which is a perspective in which every person is capable of reaching direct experience of the divine, to understand themselves as a star, to understand themselves as a god or a goddess on the planet. And I think that this is kind of like, if you don't need to look that much further than that when it comes to just understanding what Crowley was really all about, and what a lot of systems of magic, I think that the Golden Dawn system of magic, which Crowley was initiated into, is really, really similar. The idea is that when you understand the true nature of the self, and that you begin to identify with the transcendent origins of the self that comprise the universal self, the really vast, transcendent, objective self with a capital S, as opposed to being in your limited perception of just myself as a separate entity in time that has an address, that likes this kind of food, that likes this kind of music, etc. When you really begin to know who you are, then you can affect change almost like a lucid dreamer who wakes up from a dream. So all of the kinds of rituals and practices, if you look through like Crowley's magic system and you start to understand the rituals, almost none of it is about practical magic in the sense of like, if you want, $1 million, here's a ritual that you can do. Basically, none of his magical workings were about that kind of thing at all. Rather, all of his magical rituals were geared towards the transcendence of one's consciousness in a radical way to directly perceive the non-dual state. And with the Golden Dawn system, it's similar. I mean, there is an aspect of Crowley's, if you read the Liber 777, for example, that table of correspondences is meant to be utilized for practical material means. Like if you're looking to manifest more money, there's a planet that correlates with that, there's a color that correlates with that, there's a god that correlates with that, etc. And then you develop a ritual based off that. But for the most part, in both the Golden Dawn and Thelemic magical systems, the point is to elevate one's consciousness to such an extent that would enable one direct perception of the true nature of the self, to wake up out of the dream, to wake up out of the matrix. And by being awakened in that state, you can then affect change by understanding that everything that exists is only the play of your consciousness. And I think that what Fida was talking about and what other people have spoken about in regards to this astrological conjunction, it initiates the beginning of that awakening process on a collective mass scale. So if you look at what the Aeon of Horus is, or the Age of Aquarius, technically, but at least in sidereal astrology, it begins roughly in about 100 years. We're on the cusp of that. And the entire age lasts for about 2,100 years. So it's a very large span of time in which great changes in consciousness may occur. If you look back at where we were 2,100 years ago versus where we are now, it's our lives and our world is dramatically different. So you can only imagine what could happen with the exponential curve of developing technology and developments into consciousness in another 2,100 years. Like the effects could be dramatically different. But in any case, although arguably what just occurred is not the actual start of the Age of Aquarius, so-called, it at least represents a orientation towards the emergence of awareness and knowledge of the true nature of the self, or the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel, as it's often referred to within magical literature, on a mass scale, you know, where you don't need to be an initiate into the Golden Dawn. You don't need to necessarily even drink ayahuasca. You don't necessarily need to even have a steady meditation practice. This would be, you know, when it reaches a crescendo in regards to the amount of people that through various circumstances have arrived at this awareness, then it will just proliferate the consciousness of humankind on a mass scale. There'll be a tipping point at which this just becomes the norm for people to know this. And that's kind of, I think, what Crowley was referring to when he was speaking about the Aeon of Horus. And we're going to see specifically in the next chapter, there's some pretty like violent poetry around destroying and usurping the religions that be. But I think that Crowley really was just, he had a kind of nuclear determination to detonate any limitations upon people's concepts of self, to really, he had a sort of apocalyptic mission to free people from the matrix, if you want to use that as a metaphor. And so he saw Christianity and a lot of these other world religions as merely as enslaving people, you know, within their own consciousness. So I think that he wanted to be a sort of antichrist, you know, not to just create chaos and anarchy in the world, but rather to destroy that system and to establish a new one that was more geared towards the sensibilities and the requirements of the human soul. And so today we're going to be talking about the second chapter, which is spoken through the perspective of Hadith. So maybe for a moment before we begin, we can look at that, the Stele of Revealing once more, and I can point out who Hadith is. So here's the Stele of Revealing that we spoke about last time. So to briefly recap, this was the tablet that Rose Edith Kelly, under her trance, led Crowley to as the source of her divine illumination, and what ultimately created the basis for the Book of the Law. So you have in the throne, Ra-Hoor-Khuit, which is of an emanation, sort of a subcategory of Horus. And standing, there is the priest Ankh-Afen-Khonsu, the Lord of Thebes, as he is called. The woman draped over the stele, that would be Nuit. And we read the chapter that was speaking from her perspective. Last week, Nuit, as we stated, represents eternity, represents the unbounded nature of creation, represents the feminine principle, the container, if you will. You know, it could be also called nothing. She represents nothing, you know, infinite nothing, unbounded nothingness. And then underneath her directly, this wing with this red circle in the center, this is Hadith. So we will be speaking about Hadith this week in the second chapter. And so I wanted to read to you once more. So this is Lon Milo Duquette's notes, his interpretation of Hadith. The second deity of the Thelemic Trinity, the lover of Nuit. He is depicted on the Stele of Revealing as a winged globe at the heart of Nuit. He is conceptualized as the infinity of an ultimately contracted universe, the point in the center of the circle. He is the ubiquitous point of view, the only philosophically tangible conception of reality. So for me, when I hear that, the ubiquitous point of view, so like we have a consistent perspective, and this is basically all we have. That's right. That's like basically what we are, is a consistent perspective. And what that consistent perspective is, that ubiquitous point of view, is awareness or consciousness itself. So I think that on the most abstract level, Hadith represents pure awareness or consciousness, basically unfettered by identification with a sense of self, just the emergent phenomenon of consciousness that is ever present and eternal. And so Lon Milo Duquette says this is the only philosophically tenable conception of reality. And I think that when it comes down to subjective experiences, subjective beliefs, subjective perspectives about reality, the only thing that we can really agree on is that we're aware, that we have an experience of some kind. So I think that the argument that it is the only philosophically tenable conception of reality is pretty much true. Perhaps the concept of the pre-Big Bang negative singularity postulated by modern mystics. Kabbalists may wish to consider the similarities to the first veil of negative preceding Keter, Ein, which translates into nothing. So Nui, in a sense, is the field in which consciousness emerges out of. It's very difficult for us to conceptualize, but what precedes consciousness, what precedes awareness itself? And then Hadith is the awareness itself that emerges out of that. So it's still without form, and it's still without limit, but it's still not a thing. It is that which experiences all things onto itself. These are just interpretations, by the way. It's hard to say if this is actually what Crowley was, you know, I mean, if this is truly a channeled work, he was not even thinking about these concepts when he was writing this. But it's hard to say if these were his own perspectives and interpretations of it and how he intended the book to be viewed. So yeah, before we begin, I just wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts on what I've touched on so far.
Another thing that I read too that reminds me of what you're saying is that Hadith is looked at as someone who possesses the power to know, and then Nuit the power to be known. Another way of looking at it. And earlier, as you were saying, it's funny that it landed on this day that we have to discuss this chapter. Also, the mentioning of Horus, which can be kind of translated as the birth of Jesus in a way, being from Isis.
I think, well, I think Jesus has more similarities with Osiris. Mm-hmm. So if you look at like what Crowley's conception of the Aeon of Horus, the age of Christ and the age of various Christ-like figures like the Buddha, like Confucius, etc., was the Aeon of Osiris, because the Osiris myth is based around the sun, and the sun, literally the son of God, right? And the sun dies and is reborn. The sun, every day it sets and it is reborn, and but to the ancients who didn't have the same kind of perspective, like the idea that the sun is ever burning and it's only the earth that goes around it and it's an illusion, like they literally were doing ritual and prayers because they were afraid that every time the sun set that it wouldn't come up again. They didn't have this sort of consistent idea of, oh, well, the sun's never really goes away. They actually thought every single day it died and was reborn. And so that's where the myth of Osiris comes from. And so the Christ myth of he who is slain and then risen, it really directly parallels the ancient mythologies of Osiris. So when Crowley was speaking about the Aeon of Horus, he was talking about that which actually it follows. It's an evolution of that. It's separate, though. You know, so the Aeon of Osiris represents the age that we are more or less that we have been in over the last 2,000 years or so since the advent of Christianity. And now we're moving into a new radicalized perspective that might be mirrored, for example, in ideas around quantum physics, new ideas around what reality actually is, superposition, the quantum field, things like this. Like they directly reframe our ideas and understandings of life and reality as a whole. And so there's a lot that goes into kind of what the Aeon of Horus is. It's not necessarily just like a esoteric thing. It corresponds with technologies, with the way societies are structured, with people's conceptions of themselves. And I think that we already kind of live in a Crowleyan age in which, for the most part, people don't have fear that if they have sex before marriage, they're going to go to hell, things like that, which are like these limitations of people based on their idea of sinfulness or things like that. For the most part, most young people now, I mean, I'm sure there are other parts of the world where this is not true, but at least within the bubble in which I live, like, this is not the case. So people already have began to adopt the kind of ideology of do what thou wilt, right? Without understanding that, we basically can do anything, and we don't necessarily need to be afraid of being cursed to hell for eternity. That was like that's a big part of the whole emergence of the Aeon of Horus, is completely doing away with these ideas of, eternal penance into some, hell realm or something like that. So yeah, that's just that's my interpretation of it, at least.
Well, just a quick question. I'm sorry. This chapter 2. Who in the picture is right? Who in the picture again? Is it the ones?
I'll show you real quick. I'll show you. So Hadith is the red circle with the wings that's underneath Nuit.
Oh, that's Hadith. Oh, right. Okay. The names sound so similar. I'm getting mixed up. Sorry. Okay, so Hadith.
It's confusing because even like the name Ra or Qui, it goes by like 3 or 4 different names throughout the book, but they're referring to the same person. And even Hadi is referred to at certain times just as Had, etc. So it gets confusing for a lot of reasons. But according to interpretations I've read, the reason why sometimes it's referred to under these different names or through different spellings, it has to do with the gematria of the words and the numerology of the words and things like that, which I haven't looked into so deeply. I have found some websites that went pretty deep into it, but I haven't spent that much time studying it. But yeah, so like supposedly all the different spellings and things, it's because of the gematria that was represented.
Thank you. So is this Hadith? I'm trying to understand. Is Hadith consciousness, or did I get that wrong?
It's one way to look at it. It's like through the emergence of consciousness, there is a subtle perceptual shift to the awareness of self and other, very subtly. And we're not even talking about any real emergence of a self and an other. But if Nuit represents kind of absolute, just unbounded isness, like the existence of something without any consciousness of anything existing, Hadi, I think, represents the emergence of being conscious of existence itself without any identification with anything, but it's the first step into the physical material universe as we know it.
Okay. Thank you. So it's like an unbounded awareness and not differentiated yet into, like, there's no necessarily duality where there's other.
Right. Right. Yeah, the idea is that there's a transcendent awareness that exists but is without duality, right? That there's still awareness, but it's not in the realm of subject and object. And I think that that's what, on an abstract sense, that's what Hadi represents.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful because then I can see this from that perspective, and maybe I'll help me understand a little bit better.
Mm. Yeah, alone my comparisons to different spheres on the Tree of Life can be helpful because there's been a lot of writing and interpretation into the meanings of what these concepts represent on the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. So I think that, so in the Tree of Life, Keter is the first manifestation of, it's the highest on the Tree of Life, and it represents basically like our conception of divinity, you know, like the creative spark or like pure potential, right? But before that even exists, there are these really abstract spheres which aren't even on the Tree of Life, and they're called the negative proceedings of Keter. So you have Ein and you have Ein Sof. Ein Sof means limitless nothing, and Ein means nothing. So you know, they're really, really abstract and really hard to like wrap your head around because they don't even exist for us. Like we can't, like they don't exist as things within the mind. Like you can't think about it. It's impossible. So it's kind of like hard to understand them, but you can read about people's interpretations of them, right? And by reading about those interpretations, it might actually help you to understand this on another level. You know, I don't think that Crowley necessarily wrote this with the intention of these things being mapped out onto the Tree of Life. You know, like he was just taking dictation supposedly. But I think that the Tree of Life does present some good metaphors and maps for levels of consciousness that are at least interesting to understand. You know, if you want to look at it in a mathematical sense, like Ein Sof is like nothing, like literally nothing. Ein is the existence of a plane, and Keter is a point, a dot on a plane, like a single point dot on a flat plane. And probably a lot of the early conceptions of the Kabbalah were mathematical. And like this is before, you know, mathematics and science and physics and these things that we use to map out reality existed. They were kind of like proto-physicists in an interesting way.
I read it's also linked to Malkuth in the Kabbalistic tree, but I don't know enough about
what is linked to it?
Malkuth.
What is linked to it?
Hadith.
Okay, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's true. Everything's linked to Malkuth because Malkuth is the manifestation of the material universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Malkuth is basically where we are right now. Like this is Malkuth. So everything is interlinked. You know, the idea is that the Tree of Life operates in unison on all levels at all times. It's only that our shifts in perception enable us to perceive different things. But as a specific gradation of manifestation, I would say that Hadid is about as far away from Malkuth as you could probably get. Mm. And if you want to look at what, I mean, I would say that none of the three necessarily are linked to Malkuth, but Rock or Queet has a little bit more relevance to that than the other two do. The other two are more like abstract proceedings of the emergence of consciousness, mm-hmm. and aren't speaking to the material universe at all necessarily, you know? Mm-hmm. But this is also my interpretation. If your interpretation of it is that it resonates with your understanding of Malkuth, then I can't say that that's not correct.
Yeah. And that's the thing, that looking at the many interpretations, right? There's so many varieties, because that one interpretation, it says the name of Hadid is 10, whereas in the book I see 9. So I'm not sure where the 10 came from, for example.
It says my number is 9 by the fools, but with the just I am 8, and 1 in 8, which is interesting. I am the Empress and the Hierophant, thus 11 as my bride is 11. These are interesting. So yeah, okay, so like also different ways of looking at it. So like 9, and so there's 2 ways of also, and if you want to look at these as maps of the tree of life, right? There are actually different, you can either number it from Keter being 1 or Keter being 10. And so there's 2 number grades based on the arrangement of the tree of life. So I am, if he is referring to the tree of life, which I don't necessarily know he is, saying that my number is 9 could refer to either 9 ascending or 9 descending also. But I'm curious about, so just what you guys thought about, you know, the chapter itself. So we have in the previous chapter with Nui, this very sensual, feminine, Venusian, poetic, very, very heart-centered sort of expression. And the tone of this chapter with Hadith becomes a bit more hierophantic, I guess I would say. Starts to become certainly more masculine. And starts to introduce a little bit more aggression, you know, where there are certain lines that condemn others for the justification of like the glory of Hadith, right? So there's number 58. It says, deem not of change, ye shall be as ye are and not other. Therefore, the kings of the earth shall be kings forever, and the slave shall serve. There is none that shall be cast down or lifted up. All is ever as it was. Yet there are masked ones, my servant. It may be yonder beggar is a king. A king may choose his garment as he will. There is no certain test, but a beggar cannot hide his poverty. Now, this could be looked at as being condemnatory, to look at a existence of some kind of superior class of people deemed kings. But I think that there are secret keys hidden in the words, deem not of change. Ye shall be as ye are and not other. The kings of the earth shall be kings forever. I think that what he's speaking about is those who are able to perceive reality through the lens of the eternal, understand their kingliness, understand their divinity. Those who are impoverished, meaning those that see reality through the limited existence of the separate self who is bound by material needs and is ruled by material existence. These are beggars. And so I think that he's really just speaking of a shift in consciousness, you know, and this also can be grounded through this interpretation of Hadith as this universal awareness, or that which precedes the emergence of a separate sense of self, you know, that we are actually all the time. We can all basically perceive at the levels of Hadith if we can sufficiently do away with our clinging and our attachments to a separate identity. You know, the gates of heaven as they exist in the eternal moment are available to us at all times, if only we can shift our consciousness to such a degree to be able to perceive in this way.
That's what I got from it, what you're saying. When you mentioned, for example, the king and the beggar, talking about the difference in wealth and richness, that's more of a internal, richness. That's what I got when I read that.
Absolutely. I mean, he says even that a beggar may be a king, right? There is no certain test. A king may choose his garment as he will, but a beggar cannot hide his poverty. So it's to say it doesn't actually matter how much money you have, how much power you have. It has to do with your direct experience and your direct knowledge of the true nature of the self. That kingliness is determined by one's ability to perceive truth, to perceive oneself as in the true nature of the self. I think that there's I don't know, I'm not a Bible scholar, I barely read the Bible, but I think that there's a line in the Bible where Jesus says something like be ye unto kings or something like that, right? Like where he tells his followers that like you can be a king if you follow this. I know Damien Eccles has referred to this line in some of his lectures and YouTube videos and things like that.
We live like kings. You know, we have everything at our disposal that we want. I mean, everything is right here. You can make really good food. There's all these ingredients from all over the world, you know, like there's so much richness in life, I think, if you embrace that. And then I also see here, like the slave shall serve. I feel like there's a part of us, like, to survive, we have to dig into sometimes serving, and that's part of like energy exchange in this, what we're doing every day, and keeping things afloat for our families and being strong. And with that balance, we can gain our freedom, you know. So it takes the hard work. You got to dig in and do the stuff, but you don't have to be a slave in your mind. You can separate yourself from that. Slaves will serve, and you can serve for a part because you have to be a part of it, but then also to overcome and go beyond that, because then you're not a slave, you're free. You're using the system just to get to a place where you can feel free, I think, a lot of times.
It's also be like a part of, so the king is like the or lack of a better word, the higher self, or that perspective that is not the ego, and this ego is the slave, because as a body, as a like part of us is flesh and blood, and so the ego serves us. So the ego is like, if you have a higher perspective, then you could see the ego as being the servant. It serves you. It goes out and it gets food or earns money or does things, that the body needs in order to carry around this level of awareness that we have at this point in time in these bodies. And the higher perspective is the king. But if people don't have that higher perspective, then they become the slave to the ego almost. So I don't see this as something that could remind us, of that.
It's a beautiful perspective. Yeah, absolutely. It's also like, so if you do have this expanded awareness to be able to understand the true nature of the self, then you see all things as an aspect of self, right? Like, so there's no like, oh, that person has a car and I don't, or like that person is eating a feast and I'm not. If you really understand the true nature of the self, then you see this person who owns this fancy car, I am this person and I am this car, and therefore I lack nothing because I am everything, right? So it's impossible from this perspective to have any perception of lack or poverty whatsoever, because you understand in the true nature of the self that you possess everything, that the kingdom is yours, so to speak.
I think that's a really good summary. The point of the whole book to me, if you can do that, you've got it all. And we all have the power to do that. You just
Pretty much.
Yeah. like that.
Yeah, it's not about, like, the book's not meant to be used to, like, you know, do magic to be able to manifest $1 million. It's to understand the true nature of the self.
That's what I'm getting from it.
For sure. I'm just gonna grab some water for a second, but yeah, you guys can feel free to continue on, God.
I found chapter 2 very in your face as compared to chapter 1. Very almost as there's one point that said something about this isn't for the weak. Compassion is like vice for kings or something like that. So yeah, it's a totally different shift in energy in the message.
I like how Jake said the masculine perspective. What did
Yeah.
you want to say?
I was saying the first chapter is more like poetry, where the second chapter is like my discipline. Saying, look,
A discipline?
this is the way it is, and forget all, you know, this other stuff, and be damned with all the people that are not with us.
Yeah.
If they're not with us, they're against us. Where in the first chapter is more of a poetic way of saying pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like throughout it, he kind of is telling you, like, free yourself from trying to fix everything else for everyone else. Everybody's in their own experience, doing this the way they need to by their will. So there is no judgment in that, and there's not even any interference, right? We're just experiencing. And what was that word he used earlier? Like just the awareness of things. Like, we all are in a different place, and so you can't look and think you know best for anybody. Everybody's doing the thing they need to do by the will.
Yeah.
No judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see a little bit of authority as well. Maybe I might be mistaken, but like the use of the snake coming up a few times. And back in ancient Egypt, the snake was a symbol of authority and for wealth, people that were wealthy. So that's kind of what I'm getting when he speaks. And, you know, this is the way, it's not for the weak. Compassion is, you know, is a vice and things like that. It's kind of very strong.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
And everything, I find it's interconnected. Like I know Jake mentioned, for example, like the Bible. There's so many things that we can learn from it as well. And based on translation and gematria, it's really hard to get the actual information as well. So, yeah.
I found an online school that teaches about the Bible and looks at its like original Hebrew, and there's also courses on like basic Hebrew and stuff like that. I was thinking about possibly doing that. I think it's called like Jewish culture and context or something like that is the name of the online school, and it's like based in Israel, and it goes into the original, like, you know, meetings, but it's very scriptural and it's very, you know, traditionally religious at the same time, but it could be interesting.
Yeah, I'm actually looking to purchase, I don't know if you guys have heard the Companion Bible by a publisher on Beggar. It has translations. It was recommended by a historian that did a documentary on symbols on Gaia TV. And I looked it up and it's almost like $200. So yeah, I want to look more into it before I purchase it, but I would totally, if I could learn way more about it. Yeah.
There's a woman who talks about the Torah. She lives in Israel. Her name is Doreen Dotan, and she does gematria. If you ever want to watch, it's fascinating. She talks about some things that she has a completely different perspective than I've ever heard, but it's fascinating understanding. And she calls it the Book of Life, where it's God become man. So we are God become man is what it means, what that word actually means. And so she teaches from that perspective, which I feel like is a very different perspective than traditional. And there's also a lot of, she says that the feminine, because the feminine I feel like has been marginalized in either the Judeo-Christian traditions, but in reality, the feminine is really the powerful aspect. And she talks about that. So it's very interesting if you're interested, Jake, in something about traditional Torah and Judaism. I find her.
Is it on YouTube?
Yeah, she's on YouTube. It's free. I mean, Doreen Dotan.
Maybe you could either put a link in the chat here or can send it through like email or something.
Yeah, I could do that.
On that Telegram? Are you on Telegram with them?
Oh yeah, you can post it in the Telegram group.
Oh yeah, I'll put it in the Telegram group. I'll do that later. And I had a question about, I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but I had a question. This is the first time I read this, second time. The whole thing about death. I was wondering if we could talk about, maybe I'm skipping too far ahead, but at some point can we get to in the 70s where it talks about, the whole death thing. Death doesn't belong to man or something, and yet you yearn for it. If you yearn for it, then you're forever kings. I was just wondering what your interpretation might be for that. Death is like 73, death, thou shalt not. No, thou shalt long for death. Death is forbidden on man unto thee. The length of thy longing shall be the strength of its glory. He that lives long and desires death much is ever the king among the kings.
Well, he says earlier, thy death shall be the seal of the promise of our age-long love. Come, lift up thine heart and rejoice. We are one, we are none. So I think this is speaking to, in the true nature of the self, capital S, death doesn't exist. And that's what Hadith represents, is the eternal, unbounded, undifferentiated awareness and consciousness that is the foundation of all things that arise within the material universe in time. So he's out of time. And if you're out of time, then there is no beginning and no end to anything. And so death doesn't actually exist. So he's saying, you long for death, but he's saying basically that death doesn't exist, I think. And that actually our death in the kind of physical sense is our return to the true nature of the self as unbounded, undifferentiated awareness. It's a liberation from our false concepts of ourselves as a material, separate thing.
You think we forget our individual perspectives, like that you no longer remember who Jake is or something? Or do you think that you have both awareness, that there's a more powerful awareness of the more expansive viewpoint, but that you somehow can remember Jake as well?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah, I guess I'll find out someday.
I'm curious. I'm always curious about that. But I guess I'll find out. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll all find out.
Like that, if we're even like aware that we're finding out, or maybe it's another reality, like in dreams. You have a dream, and it just becomes like you just accept it. It's totally different and weird, and you just accept it as like, yeah, this is it. This is real, and you don't remember that physics. You don't remember earthly physics, or that your face doesn't look like that, and your friends don't really look like that. The house doesn't really look like that, or whatever. But you just accept it. You don't remember. So maybe that, I wonder if death is like that, which would be fine because it's just another experience.
In our family, we always say death is like an unopened present. Like you can't know, but it's going to be a gift, and it's going to be a gift, but it's like you got to leave it unopened. We can't know for sure what's there until we get the gift,
I like that.
maybe this is and always, maybe this is it. Meaning like maybe death happens, but then you just arrive back and it's like, this is the eternal moment that, like literally this, all of our ideas of, well, back in the Paleolithic era, it's like, maybe there was no Paleolithic era. Maybe this is it, So
I love that. I love
like,
that.
I mean, these rabbit holes get real
Yeah.
twisty.
I do love the message of that, though. He that lives long and desires death much is ever the king among the kings. Because in my experience, the most beautiful moments I've had was the absence of fear of death. Usually happen right after a plant medicine experience, when you get to see everything just wide open with no limitations, no boundaries, and you realize it's just, the physical body may end, but that's not the end. It's never the end. So therefore, it's such a beautiful feeling to not fear death anymore.
Yeah, and this idea of desiring death also, I think, means to desire the union of one's consciousness with higher source, or whatever you want to call it, to die the ego death. He who desires this much is a king of kings too. He who endeavors to do away with the limited concepts of self within their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other lines that were particularly, potent for people that stood out that you feel like sharing?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something. So on line 39, it says, a feast for Tahuti and the child of the prophet's secret, O prophet. I looked it up and it's Thoth,
Yeah.
another name for Thoth? Okay.
Tahuti is the original Egyptian name for Thoth. Thoth is a Greek, I think it's a Greek interpretation of it.
God.
And I do know that the quality of Thoth is silence, ironically, because Thoth represents the knower of knowledge, but also is the silent one. So maybe the secret, O prophet, is about this the secretness, the silence.
What about
Sounds like worshiping Hadith would be pretty fun. It's like, there's this line about like taking strange drugs and having feasts, and
Yeah.
sounds like fun.
Yeah.
yeah,
Sounds like a good religion.
yeah. It's like I feel like when you're looking at life with everything is new eyes, constantly new eyes. Everything is a feast because everything it just amazes me when I see things from that perspective. It doesn't matter what I'm looking at, just the physical. Everything is beautiful and magical and amazing, and even like ugly things is just like, whoa, what the heck, Just there's this amazing. Yeah, it's that word amazing, but it's a feeling of magic. It's a magical feeling about being here, where stuff has form and the wonder of it. So, yeah, anyway, that's what that meant for me. I have a question about 48. Pity not the fallen, I never knew them, I am not for them, I console not, I hate the consoled, and the consoler. What do you think that means?
Well, I mean, a lot of the times there are definitely glimmers of Crowley's personality, I think, that come out in the writing. And I think this was certainly Crowley's attitude. You know, he wasn't very gentle, you know, so to speak. He didn't really try to make people feel good, that's for sure. That wasn't his objective. So this could be a little bit of Crowleyness, which is to not try to, you know, console people, to not try to keep people in a comfortable illusion, but rather to allow for people to awaken of their own accord. Could be.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds like Hadid was not he was not in.
He's telling you not to let people perpetuate the illusion that matter matters. You know, that they're, if they're consoling.
Oh, it froze.
Mhm. Yeah, Hadid didn't pity the fool. That's what he sounds like at all. He's not an
Well,
enabler.
there's this other line I think that goes along with this, number 21. It says, "We have nothing with the outcast and the unfit. Let them die in their misery, for they feel not. Compassion is the vice of kings. Stamp down the wretched and the weak. This is the law of the strong. This is our law and the joy of the world. Think not, O king, upon that lie, that thou must die." So I think that's an important line. You know, that thou must die is a lie. Verily shall not die, but live. Now let it be understood. If the body of the king dissolve, he shall remain in pure ecstasy forever. Which means that if you die as a singular separate self, you remain in ecstatic union with the eternal. Nuit hadit braherquit, the sun, strength, and sight, light. These are for the servants of the star and the snake. So yeah, I think that other line of not consoling, it refers to, yeah, not perpetuating people's comfortable illusions, you know. And I know that there have also been, even in other traditions, like certain Tibetan teachers who have had similar perspectives, like fierce compassion. You know, the idea of like really breaking through people's illusions in a sort of radical fashion. Things that might seem unkind or cruel to us, but are actually the ultimate act of compassion, because they're liberating people from the delusion of the nature of the self, which is the source of all suffering.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I have a friend who was going to be a monk, Tibetan monk, or one of those monks, and so they have to do this crazy meditation where you have to sit up perfectly straight. You're not allowed to move, and if you move or you scratch your nose or you do anything, they whack you with a stick, right? They whack you with a stick, and you know, at first everyone's like, "What the heck?" But then they realize, I'm not saying I understand yet, but they do. They end up understanding what's going on and what it means. And there is compassion. It fosters weakness. When you're, I'm not saying we shouldn't be compassionate. I believe in compassion, but you know, when we are compassionate, we actually can enable weakness in others sometimes. And sometimes that's okay, but you know, when you're working toward being quote unquote king or a higher level of awareness, where you want the ego to be your servant instead of you being the slave of the ego, you cannot have compassion. You have to step away and say, you know, there is no suffering up here. and suffering is just a part of life, but from a different perspective. You can see it from a different perspective, and then you don't need to have compassion about it. You just realize, like, yeah, it's suffering. That's life. Like, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we shrink down. We need to continue to strive for transcendence.
Yeah. I think as human beings, sometimes we need different perspectives of how to get back up. Sometimes we want to be embraced and filled with love and light, and in other times we need a kick in the ass to get us moving. And I find that with chapter 1, it was all about love and light and embracing, and chapter 2, it's kind of like having David Goggins on your butt. And it's like, this is what it's like, and this is what you have to do, you know. And it's
Wait till you meet Ra Harquit.
oh my gosh! Well, looking forward to that.
If Hadid is David Goggins, then Ra Harquit is like what's that guy's name? The chef guy. Like,
oh my God, Gordon Ramsay.
yeah, Ra Harquit's Gordon Ramsay.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there's so much. I feel like this whole chapter with Hadid is all about liberating one's consciousness to perceive the ecstatic eternity of conscious awareness itself. It's like reaching that like peak experience of unbounded, infinite, eternal awareness. And there's these lines that I also really like. From number 27 onwards, he says, "This is a great danger in me, for who doth not understand these runes shall make a great miss. He shall fall down into the pit called Because, and there he shall perish with the dogs of reason. Now a curse upon Because and his kin. May Because be accursed forever. If Will stops and cries why, invoking Because, then Will stops and does not. If power asks why, then power is weakness. Also, reason is a lie, for there is a factor infinite and unknown, and all their words are skew-wise." So I think it's speaking to the nature of the true transcendent self being ungraspable. Like you can't reason it. You can't reason existence. It is eternal, and it doesn't fit into our small, limited human concepts and boxes that we put things into in our minds. And so he's really speaking to our ability to reach ecstatic union through complete irrationality, through obliterating all of these small, neat, organized, limited concepts of the mind, which is what practices like meditation are supposed to do. Or, you know, if you've ever had a peak psychedelic experience where you're not existing within the conceptual rational frameworks of the mind, then you kind of have had a taste of this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what if it just is? What if that's it? Like, what if that the nature of life, existence, God, reality, etc., it just is, and you can't explain it. It is just the nature of it, defies rationality, defies time, defies logic.
And that's enough.
That's enough.
That's enough.
More than enough.
More than enough.
So my grandma was right all along. When I was like 7 years old, I asked her, "How do you know God is real?" She's like, "He just is." He's been right all along. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
What do you think the cause is referring to? Is it an excuse, like excuses? Is that what he means?
It's hard to, you're a little quiet. Do you mind saying again?
What do you think the word because represents in this?
The reasoning mind, trying to grasp concepts through logic.
Oh, right, yeah. Like you're saying, it just is. There's no because of this, because of that. It just
Exactly.
is.
Yeah.
In a simpler form, I saw because as being the powers out there I don't want to pick on organized religions, but anything that's telling you this is the way it is, this is what you should believe, this is why it's this way, and this is what you need to fall in line with, this is what you need to do, this is how it all works, trust us, it's all good. To me, that's the because in a simple sense.
I love the line for there is a factor, infinite and unknown. That's like my favorite line in this whole chapter. Like when my daughter tries to argue with me about things, like I just say, like, it's my intuition. Sorry, it's infinite and unknown. You cannot explain it, but it's there. It's solid.
Yeah.
You start like reading the book of the law to your daughter. You're like, this is why. Okay, it's in the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why you got to brush your teeth, okay? Because line 32 says.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, are there any kind of like, I feel like this is actually a pretty good place to land things, but are there any sort of pressing final insights or things that you want to share or talk about before we end the call?
No, but I really like the line 78, lift up thyself. And they say it twice. It was almost like a empowering little line. I just wanted to share that. It made me feel good when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
Lift up thyself, for there is none like unto thee among men or among gods. Lift up thyself, O my prophet, thy stature shall surpass the stars. They shall worship thy name, foursquare, mystic, wonderful, the number of man, in the name of thy house, 418. Now, is he saying to lift up Aleister Crowley?
You know?
or is it people? Like, is it anybody reading it, or is it only Aleister Crowley?
Yeah.
Exactly, the 418. I think it was mentioned last time that was his number or his house number or
No,
something.
418 is the number for Aiwass, actually. It's not related to Crowley.
Oh, okay. I thought somebody mentioned there was something that he had or some kind of property with the number 418. Maybe I don't know where I heard it then. Okay.
That could be, but I'm not aware of that. Right
Well,
on.
this is overly simplistic, but I saw lift up thyself as work on your self-awareness, focus, and try to become more and more self-aware. Work at that, and then you sort of lift yourself up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as, so if this is dictated to Crowley, who's the prophet, then it is speaking to Crowley, but it's also speaking to every reader of the book who is also the prophet of Hadith. And that we're all prophets in a way by receiving this and internalizing this knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, right on. Oh, please, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for some of the vocabulary you've given us. I appreciate that. I don't know if I'm lazy or what, but I probably could look some of this stuff up, but I'm really rereading the text to try to understand. But like for first chapter, number 8, about the soul is in the star, I would have never gotten that if I didn't know what Krebs and I can't remember the other word, what that was. You explained that, and it just opened everything up for me. So I want to say thank you for that.
Sure, yeah, my pleasure. I'm, as I read this, also not aware of all the vocabulary and trying to research it and understand it as I go.
Line 8 meant nothing to me until you gave me the vocabulary, and it's like means everything. It's real. I think it was a perfect beginning of the whole book. It sort of tells you, well, this is where it is right here. I'm telling you, trust me, this is what it's going to be. The soul is in the star.
Mm. It would be a great tattoo. I just thought of that. Eh?
Yeah. Not the star in the soul. Worship then the soul, and behold my light over you.
Mhm.
And he kind of, everything before that's telling you, get ready, here it comes. Everybody, you got the power, you're the star, here it comes. I'm going to tell you what it's all about. Boom. But if you don't understand that
Mhm.
vocabulary,
Yeah, right. Yeah, for me it was the same the first time I read it. I was like, what is a cob?
yeah.
Awesome, guys. Well, we'll meet again next week, and we'll talk about the most difficult to digest chapter, the one of Ra Requite, the one that caused Lon Milo Duquette to set his book on fire.
Yeah.
Nice.
So keep a fire extinguisher close on hand.
Awesome.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks. Night.
Thanks, Dave.
Awesome, guys. Yeah, have a good night. Enjoy the rest of your solstice. Happy solstice and merry great conjunction for all of you.
Bye, everyone.
Namaste. Bye, you guys.
All right, 93. Much love.
Mm.